Hello and welcome to Criminal Record, the Daily Record's weekly crime show. My name is Molly Finlay and I'm joined by our crime reporter Norman Silvester. Today we'll be touching on the tragic case of Phoenix Spencer Horn, whose killer has this week been jailed for a minimum of 23 years. And we'll be bringing you an update on Operation Portaledge and what gang kingpin Steven Lyons has been up to behind the scenes. On Monday, 27-year-old Ewan Methven was sentenced for the murder of his girlfriend Phoenix Spencer Horn. Judge Lord Matthews described at Glasgow High Court the way in which Methven betrayed both Phoenix and her family's trust, robbing her of her life at the flat they shared in South Lanarkshire. Due to his guilty plea, Lord Matthews ordered Methven to spend at least 23 years behind bars before he can be considered for parole. Norman, you've been covering the crime beat in Scotland for years. How unusual is it for an incident like this to happen where the partner has had no previous criminal convictions?
This is a very unusual incident. It's both horrifying and tragic in equal measures. We have a young woman here, 21-year-old Phoenix Spencer Horn, at the start of her life. She'd been in a relationship for around 2 years with Ewan Methven. They've set up home together in a top floor flat in East Kilbride. Methven has no previous convictions. He has no history of violence. The relationship seems to be a good one. They're both working. Phoenix has two jobs, a couple of jobs. One's in a hotel and others in a cafe. Euan Methin has a job as a postman. On that particular Friday evening, Methven had been waiting at home for Phoenix to return after her work. She comes home on Friday evening. They order a takeaway meal, which they eat, and everything seems to be fine. And then inextricably events unfold, which I know have left the family, Phoenix family, bereft, and I know horrified police officers who were called in to investigate. We understand around about the early hours of the Saturday morning, Methven has attacked Phoenix. Why, we don't know. What prompted it, we don't know. But Harry carried out the most horrific assault in which he has decapitated Phoenix and attempted to dismember her body. And then during that whole sort of long weekend, he's driven about in her car, pretended to her mum that she was texting her, whereas in fact he was carrying out the text. And he also appears to have taken large amounts of cocaine, alcohol, and possibly other drugs. This was volunteered as a kind of plea and mitigation almost by Methven, but it was one that the judge didn't accept. Lord Matthews didn't accept that there was any explanation or plea and mitigation, that this was a horrific and unjustified attack. In fact, Methven's own defence counsel, Tony Graham, KC, suggested that Phoenix's family, who had taken him in and treated him as one of their own, would consider him the personification of evil. As we discussed earlier, no previous convictions. There was no history of violence that we were aware of against Phoenix, but we do know that the family, Phoenix's family, have donated quite significant sums to Women's Aid. This is money that they've raised themselves, but was also donated to them to help with funeral costs, which they have since passed on to Women's Aid organisation. What's also interesting from Lord Matthews' comments was that normally when you get a life sentence, there's a tariff, and that's a minimum you must serve. Now, Lord Matthews indicated that had the case gone to trial and had he been convicted, he would have received a tariff of 27. Now, that's a minimum amount of time, 27 years, that you must serve before you be considered for parole. That's not when you get out, that's when you start the parole process. But because he'd pled guilty, he was entitled to a discount, and that was reduced to 23 years. So Euan Methven must serve a minimum of 23 years before he can be even considered for parole. But interestingly, Lord Matthews issued a caveat that it would be up not to him or the courts, but the parole board to decide if or when he would ever be released. So there's a suggestion there that though he would be entitled to apply for parole, Methven apply for parole in 20 years' time when he'll be around 50 years age, there's no guarantee that he'll ever get parole. And it's quite possible he could spend the rest of his life behind bars.
And do you think this is an indication of a wider problem? Does there appear to be a rise in femicide in the UK and in Scotland?
There's no doubt that in the last 10 years we've seen a growth in quite serious levels of domestic violence. More and more women are coming forward to report domestic violence, which is increasing the figures. But at the sharp end, we're seeing more and more horrific attacks that are resulting in the deaths of women. Quite often these are in the home. Quite often they are involving couples, married couples or couples that are living together. Quite often there's a history of abuse. The woman may have suffered assaults in the past, but for whatever reason she's stuck with the partner, and the fatal attack has been the kind of if you like, the final act of violence against the victim. But what's unusual about this case is that there doesn't appear to have been any previous history of violence. But having said that, it's the death and murder of Phoenix Spencer Horn by Euan Methin is yet another horrifying example of the growing number of fatal attacks on women in Scotland.
We're going to move on now and talk about Operation Portaledge, which is the investigation into the gang violence that's been gripping Scotland recently. What is the latest on this, Norman?
As we featured in Criminal Record before, there was an outbreak of violence around about early March against members of the Daniel crime family and their associates. This continues through March, April, May and into June. And the attacks were said to be orchestrated by a Ross McGill, an underworld figure based in Dubai. And he in turn has got close ties to the Lyons family, who in turn are in a long running feud with the Daniel family. Now we know that the larger number of assaults, fire bombings and attacks on commercial premises linked to the Daniel family and Daniel associates have been carried out between March and June. There were also incidents in East Kilbride, Bridge of Weir and parts of the Lothians. Police launched Operation Portaledge. That was targeting those responsible. Now it's said that the violence had been orchestrated by a Ross McGill, a former Glasgow Rangers Union Bear and Ultra leader, who's now based out in Dubai. And he'd set up an organisation of young men called Tamo Junto, who were carrying out the various assaults, often to the endangerment of life. We know of an incident when an elderly woman's life was put at risk and a 12-year-old boy's. So police launched Operation Portaledge, which has been very successful. It's resulted to date 54 arrests, with I understand more in the pipeline.
And tell us a bit about the story we had in the Daily Record this week. What has Steven Lyons been up to?
Steven Lyons is the senior member of the Lyons family, the Lyons crime clan. As we said earlier, and we featured in Criminal Record in the past, they're involved in a long-running feud with the Daniel family that's resulted in murders and quite serious violence in the last 25 years. We know that a lot of the violence, current violence being orchestrated from Dubai by Ross McGill is linked to the Lyon and Daniel feud. Ross McGill, it was alleged that Ross McGill was ripped off in a cocaine deal by members of a faction linked to an Edinburgh cocaine dealer called Mark Richardson, who in turn got links to the Daniel family, close connection to the Daniel family. So that's all part of a feud and ongoing gangland violence. Steven Lyons is based out in Dubai. At the end of March, his younger brother Eddie Lyons Jr. and another associate of both men, Ross Monaghan, were both shot dead at Ross Monaghan's bar in Fungarola, for which a man's currently awaiting extradition to Spain to stand trial. So Steven Lyons, we know, as he based out in Dubai. His brother's funeral and that of Ross Monaghan was early this month, on July the 4th. He chose not to attend for his own safety. He believed his life would be at risk if he returned to Glasgow, and he watched it via a live stream from Dubai. We subsequently learned that he's had some cosmetic surgery done. We believe to alter his appearance, maybe to give him more protection, and he had fillers done to his cheek. He had dental work and Botox. I think obviously one would assume to improve his appearance, but obviously to change it. And it's understood that a lot of this work is to, if you like, alter his appearance and to give him greater protection.
Do you think it's likely to work?
It may well do. And he's safe enough in Dubai. Nobody's going to target him in Dubai. But as things stand, it's unlikely he'll ever be able to return to Glasgow in the foreseeable future. We don't really know the last time he was in Glasgow. We believe he left Glasgow for Spain and then Dubai around about 2006. That followed a fatal shooting at a garage run by his father David Lyons, in which his cousin Michael Lyons was shot. Stephen Lyons was shot himself but survived. Another associate, Robert Pickett, was also shot. So he's not really spent much time in Scotland since then. We believe he may have been back around about 2008, and there's a photograph from that period. But we featured in the Daily Record photographs of Stephen Lyons, and it was with his new cosmetic work, and that's the most recent photograph of him in recent years. Though there might be a kind of humorous aspect to this, there's obviously these guys are in fear of their lives. You know, it's a constant looking over their shoulder, so it would make sense to take some measures that they can to protect themselves.
And finally, we're going to touch on an older case, one related to the murder of Euan Johnston in Glasgow almost 10 years ago. Can you tell us about why this case is back in the headlines?
Well, this was a gangland linked murder in November 2016. Euan Johnston was someone who was known to the police. He was based out in Maryhill, a young man. He was due to stand trial on heroin charges, and he'd spent the evening in the south side of Glasgow, the Pollux Shields area. He'd gone for dinner with a friend, and they were basically returning back to Maryhill. He was parked in his car in Scotland Street at a set of lights, and at this juncture, a mystery man suddenly emerges from the shadows and shot Euan Johnston dead through the windscreen of the car. The gunman then escaped in a waiting getaway car, which was driven away over the Kingston Bridge, over the M8, and abandoned in the Milton area of Glasgow. 2 years later, a man, David Scott, stood trial for the murder. He was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. And he must do a minimum of 22 years before he can be considered for parole. But the police have always believed a second man was involved, whether it was the actual gunman or the getaway driver. Under Scots law, it doesn't make any difference. So they've been trying to search for evidence to bring that person to trial and justice. And they got a tip-off last week that the actual weapon, the firearm, the handgun used in the murder of Euan Johnston, had been abandoned in a kind of remote area of hillside, grassy area in Oban. So they set up Oban in Argyllshire. So they set up quite a major search around about a week ago, searching for the gun, which continued over several days. But it was eventually abandoned around about the Friday when they didn't find the gun. But it was an interesting case because it's not really featured much. We know since the trial in 2018 when David Scott was convicted, it's gained very little coverage, but it shows that the police have still behind the scenes been trying to identify and bring to justice the killer. Obviously, if they'd found the gun, that might have had evidence, such as DNA or even fingerprints that could have linked him to the killer. It's an interesting case because it was based mainly on circumstantial evidence. The man who was convicted, they'd found his hood in a getaway, in a jacket in a getaway car with his DNA in the zip. and a man in a similar hood or jacket had been seen doing a surveillance on Johnston in the hours before the actual murder took place, so they'd be keeping an eye out for him. But it certainly shows that this is a murder where the police are still investigating, and there could be further criminal proceedings in the future.
That's really interesting. Thank you, Norman. Thanks for joining us on Criminal Record this week. If you have any questions for the team, you can email reporters@dailyrecord.co.uk with the subject line Criminal Record. We'll be back next week. You can subscribe to listen to this podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, or you can watch it each week on our YouTube channel. Thanks again.